If you are joining us online, welcome. We are about to get started, so let me go ahead with our introduction. On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. We are here in the tavern and online. And I would like to thank our sponsor for the Voices for Truth discussion series, and that is School Outfitters. To learn more about them and all their cool furniture, you can go to schooloutfitters.com. All right, we have lots of things going on, so you'll just have to go to our website and check out all the things going on. It's gonna have time to list it all today. We will start with the timeline that John always prepares. Then we'll get into some discussion questions about the readings. And if you didn't finish all the readings, that's okay. We will fill you in on all the macabre stuff that happens in those readings. But we just welcome lots of discussion. We do have a larger number of people online today, so that's great. If when we get to the discussion part, you want to jump in and you can find a space to do so, go ahead. If you feel like you can't find a space, do your virtual hand raise, and I will then acknowledge you so that we can get everybody into this. All right, we'll go till about 8:15-ish, and then let's do some wrap up. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and put up your timeline. Is that what you'd like next?
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Come on. All right. Here we
go. Okay, so that 1764 date that's up at the top has nothing to do directly with Harriet Beecher Stowe or any of the authors we're looking at tonight. It's just that the author Walpole generally gets credit for writing the first Gothic novel. Gothic being the literature of terror and horror. So that's why we're doing this from in the Halloween season. We note some highlights on the timeline to note. Harriet Beecher's birth, 1811 in Connecticut. She moves to Cincinnati in 1832, and as her biographer Joan Hendrick said, she came to Cincinnati as a New Englander, but she left as an American, because it is during her 18 years in Cincinnati that she becomes, confronts the issue of slavery in a way that she wouldn't have had to had she stayed back home. She becomes Harriet Beecher Stowe by marrying Calvin Stowe in 1836. And interestingly, the overlap when I put these timelines together, I always noticed the overlap here. Harriet's about 30 years old when George Washington Cable gets born in New Orleans. And as a kid, he read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Not until the 1850s, because it wasn't written until 1851, 52, but he, in later life, he looked back and said, that book had an impact on me. I remember it. So we might want to look when we talk about his story, we might want to look and see if you hear any echoes of Uncle Tom's Cabin in there. Of course, she writes the book serially in 1851, starts writing it, completes it in 52, and it's published in book form to great success in 1852. The next year, she publishes A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, defending herself against Southern critics of the book and arguing that, if anything, she was too easy on slavery, not too tough on it, as the critics argued. She continued to work against slavery in her novel Dread, and visited actually in 1862, met with President Abraham Lincoln at the White House. We don't know exactly what they talked about, but my guess is that she was making sure he was really going to follow through on the Emancipation Proclamation that he had floated back in September of that year, and indeed he did sign it going into effect January 1st of 63. So by the 1860s, Washington cable was also affected by these events. He's in the Civil War on the Confederate side. Remember, he's from New Orleans, in the cavalry. He gets wounded in battle. And in the years after that, for about 10 years, 10, 15 years, he's recovering from the wound. He gets malaria. And in a 2-year convalescence, he starts writing, teaching himself French, and researching New Orleans history, which certainly shows up in the story that you read. And he became a journalist as well. 1867, the war's over for 2 years. It has been over for 2 years. Calvin and Harriet Beecher Stowe buy a house in Mandarin, Florida, near Jacksonville. And that's where the story is set that we read tonight, for tonight. I think 17 winters there, had a good share of the late 60s and 1870s writing "Come to Florida" tracts, calling Yankees to Florida. Her goal was to get Northerners who were anti-slavery to move to Florida in order to not have it be as much of a slave-oriented state as it had been before the war. And a lot of tourists did move to Florida during those years. 1874, cable publishes the short story that you read for tonight, Belle Demoiselles Plantation, in Scribner's Monthly, a big Eastern establishment periodical at that point. So his career is beginning in the 1870s, and hers is winding down by the 70s. Her last novel, Poconoke People, published in 1878. But she had one more story, and that's the one that we read for tonight, 1882. That's very late for her. We think this was the last story she wrote. And it was published in the Christmas issue. Might not sound like a Christmassy kind of story, but the Christmas ghost story was a tradition. Think Turn of the Screw, think of Christmas Carol. Yeah. And that was, so here is her cheery Christmas story. And the editor was it was an interesting periodical because they published articles favoring the Southern point of view, but also the Northern point of view. And the author, the editor, Albien Tourget, wound up actually defending Plessy in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. That he lost the case and segregation became legal as a result of that. Interestingly, Harriet's story receives no notice and is not anthologized, will not be reprinted until 2021. It's not even mentioned in Joan Hedrick's biography as one of her, in her bibliography at the end, where she lists all of Harriet's stories. So we might want to think about why that is, why a story like this doesn't survive until many years later. Abel then is a buddy of Mark Twain's, and they did this Twins of Genius tour, where Cable's strict Presbyterianism annoyed Twain, and Twain was always playing jokes on him and making fun of him, but he did respect him as a really valuable writer about the South. Let's see, Cable further alienated the Southern audience, much as Stowe had in her day, by publishing The Silent South and another work, The Negro Question, in which he was arguing for integration, for equal justice for African Americans. He finally moved out of the South. Life became impossible for him there, and so he moves to Northampton, Massachusetts. He's still alive. So Harriet dies in 1896. Cable's still alive, fleeing from the South at this point. And William Faulkner is born in 1897. So he and Cable overlap. Actually, he missed overlapping with Harriet just by 1 year. And it has been said that Cable was an influence on Faulkner. And we could think about how that might have worked out. So Faulkner is associated with Mississippi. He puts the U in his name. The family just spelled it Falkner, but like Nathaniel Hawthorne, put the W in his name. Faulkner put the U in his name. Why? Maybe to distinguish himself from his ancestors. Who knows? Maybe because he thought it was cool that Hawthorne did that. But it's that self-fashioning that we see in so many writers, and we've seen it in a lot of African-American writers too. So there's an overlap here with Cable. He's still alive until 1925, and that's about the time in the 20s Faulkner is publishing his first works. The Marble Fawn was a book of poetry. He said, the novelist is a failed poet. I really wanted to be a poet, but nobody liked my poetry, so I started writing novels. And he did a pretty good job of that. In 1930, the short story Arose for Emily comes out. But by the late 20s, he's already published The Sound and the Fury and written As I Lay Dying. And you could tick off a lot of the other titles. 1932, Light in August. And then the book that I like the best, well, the two books I like the best of Faulkner's, Absalom, 1936, and Go Down Moses, 1942. So he is really, has an immense body of work. I'm omitting many of the titles that he wrote, just as I omitted many of the titles that Harriet wrote in her later years leading up to the 70s and 80s. And then he dies in 1962, having won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Okay. Well, that's kind of an overview of these folks and how they interact with one another, overlap with each other. So, Kristen, you want to pose the first question here?
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard a great overview of where all these people are situated in time. And of course, their texts, it would be too nice if they neatly followed. The earliest textual happening we have, not the earliest written, but the earliest textual happening we have is Demoiselles Plantation. It happens in the early 19th century, rather than when it's written in 1874. So this is the only story that happens during enslavement. So why do you think he set that story in those first decades of the 19th century?
You can jump in. If you're online and you want to jump in, go ahead.
Yeah.
If you don't feel, if you're either timid or if we're all talking and you can't get a word in, raise your hand, virtual hand, and I will encourage you so that we can get everybody in.
No, I'm trying to think of all the other stories or books that I've read that are set in a previous time period.
Mhm.
A lot of authors do that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a lot too. I think maybe a better way to, or a clear way to ask that question is like, what does setting it during enslavement maybe do for the story that would not be accomplished by having it happen post Civil War?
Okay.
Well, maybe just the imploding or the spontaneous giving away of the river and damaging damaging the plantation is a way of saying that everything in this case Louisiana, but has encroached on, you know, this is a system that's not stable. It's not going to continue because it's just going to fall in itself. And
Yeah.
so enslavement is part of that system. It's eventually going to cave in on itself.
Man, it's a pretty powerful metaphor, right? The plantation home literally crumbling into the river, being washed away. Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. Thinking about it as indication that the groundwork, even in the early 19th century, is not simple here.
And it didn't necessarily destroy the guy that found it, but it destroyed his family.
Yeah.
And so that also is another kind of layer of that in terms of this is a system that is going to perpetuate destruction or move destruction forward. Right, I'm done. Other people's turns.
I mean, in some ways, we don't have maybe a representation of racial dynamics that are as familiar in the story. In the sense that we have a lineage of a first marriage to an indigenous woman or first relationship. It's not clear exactly how this all played out, and then a migration, and then a return with an Anglo wife, and then so you have these like branching of the family tree. We have these two kind of side by side families coexisting to some extent, but also very unequally, right? But having somebody as a part of the family, as the racialized other, as an indigenous, someone of indigenous ancestry, although here he's claimed just as like he was no longer a part of the indigenous community, right? He's just like, yeah, which is also interesting, but and yet they're still distinct, right? It's a different kind of dynamic than.
Did you argue it's potentially acceptable to the word choice she uses, which would probably have been accurate for how things would have been spoken in conversation, things like that? Theoretically, post-Civil War would have been considered maybe less appropriate, maybe, I'm not sure. So by setting it back so far, she was able to write it more authentically. Probably.
So no, I think that's helpful. So like the discourse between the two might have been.
I don't know that we could write this today.
Oh yeah, no. We couldn't write any of these today, including using their linguistic terms, maybe the Faulkner, but yeah, absolutely, right. Some of the most egregious racist language and things like that we see here might not have been written post enslavement, although again, racism did not go away post enslavement either.
This is true.
Some ways I thought the so we'll jump too far ahead, but the first two questions interesting in terms of whether we're thinking about the timing of it when I was reading it. Although I mean the captain's story, because it was a boat. It was set during enslavement, but it's written after, but well, I mean, okay, so the frame story was set.
Yeah.
flashback was, anyway, I wasn't thinking necessarily about the timing per se.
Mhm.
While I was reading it, so I find the questions interesting as to why you guys thought that that would be something interesting to talk.
Making us answer our own questions here. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me, well, first of all, I think the story is helpful in that it points out or reminds me that racial relationships have always been in sort of 19th century Southern writing way more complicated than we might tend to gloss them. And the particular racial relationships in New Orleans and that history of Creolism, which is both a white phenomenon, but then also about multiracial identifications, but also like racial mixing is very different in the way that it's constructed. Like there's just, it's its own unique thing in some ways, and yet still some of the same kinds of seriously deadly consequences remain for those who have put themselves in a power position. I mean, like, even before his house crumbles, it's already crumbling. He does not own it anymore. Essentially, his poorer relative has basically bailed him out time and again. He is indebted financially, again, metaphorically, very much to this other side of his family. And his house and all of his daughters sink and die, even though he does not ultimately betray his relation, which is also interesting, right? And again, if we're thinking about this as pre Civil War story, we have a guy who like decides at the last minute, no, I'm not going to go through with this. I'm actually going to honor my kinship to you rather than betray you in this way. Right. He takes a step back and says, I'm going to have this familial thing privileged, and yet it doesn't matter. The house is doomed anyway, right? So maybe there's something there about the futility of solving racism or the problems that it causes. Maybe there's something there about the critique of becoming, I don't know, woke too late, and not taking ownership of the damage it was caused. Those are very formed thoughts for me.
There was also, and it was just like a one line, it, you know, could have missed it kind of thing, but also something that talked about the familiarity of the Creole society and how everything, you know, was just, oh, he was going to the quadroon ball. And it was like, and that was just, you know, a normal everyday occurrence. And that speaks to all of the Creole culture of New Orleans, in that someone who was groomed would be exemplified as the ladies of the home.
That was part of the whole system
Right.
called plaçage, and the women involved were called placé, that is placed. This was where wealthy white guys could go and meet quadroon mistress. Yeah.
Okay. Did I miss that?
Well, you have to know a little of the history, but he got in arguments
Come on, right? Let me have a.
danced and quarreled at the Philippe Street Theater Quadroon Ball.
Mhm.
So it made me wonder, and that sounds like maybe an off the wall thing, but where all these Demoiselles came from?
Mhm.
Because there's very little mention of his wife in here. She's Scotch and beautiful apparently, but that's it. She's gone.
Dies after a year, I think. Yeah, she dies after.
Falls off the page.
Oh wait, no, yeah,
No,
we don't say,
that's the
that's the original
generation
family, yeah,
back.
yeah.
But we sure.
Harriet also talks about, Harriet talks about that in Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, talks about the quadroon balls. I don't remember the woman's name. One of them at the very
Cassie?
end.
Yes.
Cassie, yeah, thank you.
Cassie was the quadroon, yeah.
That's right. I'm bad at names, right? So
But,
It's-
and, sorry.
go ahead.
No, and in Uncle Tom's Cabin, she was set up as one of these women who were nice
Mhm.
and then got dumped because she got too old. Yes, so that was very ingrained in
Mhm.
New Orleans culture throughout the 1800s.
And the whole region really, Louisiana, throughout Louisiana, even in Mississippi, this whole massage culture existed. So, so I think that's one way to come at it. What did you think about the ending of the story? Where Charlie winds up taking care of this guy who was about to swindle him, and has never been very nice to him.
They were family. Who took care of the family?
I think it's a way of raising up the character of Charlie. Higher, he's the noble, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah, one critic I read compared him to Uncle Tom, Uncle Tom's Cabin. That he's merciful to people beyond what most of us would be merciful. Or well, I was interested in it, and I'm responsible for the question. I'll take responsibility for the weird question. Because the early 19th century was a time of transition in New Orleans, in Louisiana, from French rule to US rule, to the Louisiana Purchase. And yet these French aristocrats lived on, and there had also been a period of Spanish influence there too, before France got it back again in time to sell it to the US. So it's a time of transition, and the role of English in the story, it's a second language, and most of these characters just think it's sort of a flashy language to speak. The Demoiselles only make fun of their dad when he's going off to see Charlie, and he speaks English with Charlie. But that's kind of stepping down off the French pedestal to do that. So it's a transitional time there, and think of the South after the Civil War. At the time Cable is publishing this story, big transition. They're in the midst of Reconstruction at this point, winding down really Reconstruction. So what is the South going to be? Cable has his hopes for the South, but it didn't turn out that way. He said at one point, I hear these stories of the New South, which is a little later, of the New South. What I want is no South. Away with all of these traditions and just be part of the US. Which is why he had to move to Massachusetts, yes.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is about the ending in particular. I mean, I do think Charlie's far too kind. But he also, it doesn't cost him anything to be. In fact, like he seems relatively unscathed through all of this. And so the focus for me then tends to be on our other critiques, right? And specifically the way in which the Colonel is affected by all of his attempts to either distance himself from or become closer to or negotiate with Charlie. Like there is this reckoning of the relationship and what it means that seems to in no way bother, like Charlie seems totally like, you're my family, we're good. But it is a point of contention for the Colonel. He has to go back to him so many times. They keep going back through this. What do I owe him? What don't I owe? What do I owe my kids? Like he can't figure it out. There's this imbrication there that he seems deeply aware of and also deeply interested in denying. And that strikes me as a very kind of post Civil War attitude. Like, what are you gonna do now? Like, we have this deeply imbricated cultural, familial connection. How are we gonna move in any way forward? Are we gonna move forward? What do we need to destroy in order to move forward?
Well, maybe we should, any other comments or questions about that story before we move on? Let's move to Harriet Beecher Stowe's story. Another one of these time questions. She published it in 1882, very late in her writing career, probably at the end of her writing career. Why would she set the story back in 1866, right after the Civil War?
You thought it was just the basic message of just because the war over doesn't mean anything's really changed.
Well, that could certainly be one of the themes of the story. I
Just
yeah.
because you outlawed slavery doesn't mean you can forget it. It's going to haunt you.
Even though the Southern propaganda machine at that time was cranking out all sorts of writing about how great things were before the Civil War. And
She wouldn't have bought that.
so Harriet was spending time in Florida, knowing what it was like there. Yeah, may well be questioning that popular view. And there was also a time by the 1880s, the North was getting tired of sort of reconstructing the South or ministering to the South in some ways. And a lot of people said, okay, it's over. Slavery's over. We won the war. Well, let them go. Let's just let the South go. Let's stop worrying about it. There was a certain weariness in the North, I think, about attending to racial injustice at that point, which wonderfully opened the door from a Southern perspective to create to reinstate all of the oppressive laws that they could come up with.
I mean, one of the things I was struck by reading this, I mean, it's only in its most nominal way a ghost story, right? Like there is not really a ghost story so much as, yeah, there's a haunting going on here, but like it's mostly just a horrific story of violence. And the skipper is totally cool with that. Like
As to why anybody would be upset by this.
he's happy to help you. He's so happy to tell you about the people he's murdered. Like, it's a very unrepentant, very, obtuse view of any of this. And it's not even clear that there's a warning involved. It's like, it doesn't even seem like there is like well, the ghost is still haunting him and we should care. Like, it's kind of just like, yeah, there's this ghost here, but everything is fine as we did it. And so in this moment where at the very end where he says the overseer couldn't stand it, now nobody lives in it, nobody wants to go near it after dark, and Charlie says good, and that somehow sparks a moment of questioning or inquiry from the skipper, but it's very quickly like done away with by our nervous narrator. I'm very interested in the intractability of the story. Like,
Well, but the other thing is that the Northerners who are visiting there, they just learned the guy who's rowing them up the, or not rowing, but taking them up the river is a murderer, and they're like, don't really seem that concerned. Like, Dan,
Yeah, so I'm sure other people noticed the religious overtones. If I'm not mistaken, this is occurring after the Civil War and slavery is outlawed, but nonetheless, slave trading is still going on. Is that correct for one thing?
Now, I
No?
think the slave running was before the war.
yeah,
The story
Okay.
is being told after the war.
so it's a
But there's
flashback.
this religious overtone also, and the religious overtone is that it's morally okay to do this, that these African American slaves are not human. And one of the very last lines of the whole story is, well, I'm a Methodist. Right, that's one of the very last lines that the captain says, I'm a Methodist. And he excuses what's going on. So I saw this religious overtone to it also. This reminds me, there's a place, the whole setting is on the St. John's River. And I'm live here in Jacksonville, but it's on the St. John's River, and there's actually a old plantation there, a slave plantation there, the Kingsley Plantation, where I could just see all this happening. This is just at the bend in the river. They talk about the bend in the river and the like. And there's slave quarters there and a slave house, and it's a very interesting story. And but I think there's some religious overtones to it of Christianity or lack of Christianity.
Which would be consistent, well, somebody else wanted to talk. That would be consistent with Stowe's criticism of false Christianity in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where
Right.
Celia goes and here's this sermon about how great the Bible supports slavery and all this. So yeah, I think you're right, Dan.
there is. I do want to acknowledge, Dan. I think you're also right that, like, on the top of, I don't know my page, 1170. There is that when they're talking about the slave running, it is noted that the actual sort of transport of enslaved individuals was considered now piracy, right? So that was not supposed to be happening. Enslavement still legal, but that transport not legal, right? So you have this strange dichotomy where it's the problem that they're on the boat. The problem is not that they are enslaved, right? If they just are on land, totally fine, not a big deal. But while they're on the water, then he's broken this other, which again is a sort of moral blindness or like a way to think about right and wrong that is wildly absurd. Thank you.
Yeah, you're breaking the law, so what do? To fix that? You kill all the people in there.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, they don't kill people because they've dehumanized these slaves. They're
Yeah.
not people. They don't kill people.
Property.
So they've dehumanized them so badly that there's something to trade and we'll get in trouble with when we're trying to trade them.
Things that I noticed, in particular about this story was how Harriet's writing has improved. You think of the dialect in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is almost a showstopper for some people trying to read. You can't get, I don't know what she's going on, what she's saying. They've got like tears. Well, relatively speaking, excellent. And you can follow it, and it's probably pretty. I would guess that it's fairly authentic. But even her sentence structures, she's got more compound or complex sentences, and some her transition. There was just a lot of better things happening from a stylistic standpoint in this than Tom's Kids.
Because she wasn't rushing as much, but still it's.
Right, she wasn't rushing, and she didn't have 6 kids in here.
And she had some experience.
And plus she probably had an editor or two, she had a chance to rewrite it, whereas Uncle Tom's Cabin, she didn't have a chance to think through a second time. She wrote it once and it got published.
Yeah, but again, think of her age and her experience. That means a lot.
Yeah.
As far as young Harry doing Uncle Tom's Cabin in that mature area writing this piece.
I felt naive reading this, that it never occurred to me that people would break the law of bringing slaves from Africa. I just thought of them, It's like, okay, they're done with that. It's good.
Yeah.
All the stuff on the back.
I love your point, Jayan, and I wonder then, given this, like that the writing is pretty tight here. It's such a short story. So we have this image of the general once he finds out that this crew is coming to arrest him. It says he looked like a thundercloud and he swore like thunder. And then the skipper's like, oh no, I got the solution. We'll just kill him. That's the exact same image that we get at the end. Charlie looked like a full charged thundercloud after he finds out about this outcome. But then the narrator says, don't waste your powder, Charlie. If the Lord can have patience, we can. If he's slow, he's sure. That's a super fascinating parallel to me, because it posits our narrator as the person who's like, we should tolerate the amoral. We should tolerate other people. Who are we to judge? It equates that with this and his they both calm the storm by doing very different things, but they're aligned in this way. It makes me think that this is a very sharp critique of this idea that we should sit back. Who are we to judge others? Well, we're people who think it's not okay to murder people. That's who we should be, right?
I revisited Mandarin, Florida, when we were down in Jacksonville, and it was interesting. There's a museum there, the church that they built, that they funded the building up, but there's a stained glass window that had the Stowe name on it, and the woman who showed us around her perspective was kind of interesting. I had come away from that thinking of Harriet Beecher Stowe as a PR professional because her plan was, okay, we have to go down and we have to find something for Frederick to do. So we're going to buy this orange grove, and he can run this orange grove, and then we can come down in winter because God knows what the winters are like up north. And by funneling more and more Northerners down here, we can help change the societal structure. And she, you know, she was a promoter, she was a PR person. And then backs up, you know, it's like you have a strategy and then you back up and you do an evaluation and you go, well, this worked, but not this, and not this, and what are we gonna do and how are we gonna make this better? And she did that, you know, in part, just even by writing this and giving some perspective there, but also trying to stem the tourism because it wasn't, all it was feeding more money into the southern suburbs and not necessarily making the change that she had hoped it would make. You know, I've always thought of her as very gutsy and very visionary, but to think when she just rolled up her sleeves and did this, oh my golly, because somebody's got to do it, right? And I a lot of credit for that, especially for a woman at that time to do that kind of thing. And she had enough influence that she could pull it off.
And she was a Beecher, she could do everything.
She was
So, you know, thinking along those lines, I wonder what happened with Harriet that gave her the impulse or whatever to write this particular story. You know, what did she, 6, 8 years before she died? And
Well, 14,
14.
but then she had dementia for some of those later years too.
okay, so, I mean, this story is so brutal.
It is.
And so is she trying to say, oh crap, nothing is working? It's, you know, the whole thing is kind of bringing people to the South didn't work. Having a school for Black kids didn't work. I give up. Not I give up, but it's just, we're never gonna get past the viciousness of slavery. And I wonder what happened to her that year that caused her to write.
I love that. I love that question. I think that's right. I keep being drawn to this passage where the skipper, again, my favorite character, he's so terrible, says, there's a point on this river that we sailed by yesterday where there's a nice, comfortable house that used to be lived in and now it stands all solitary and going to ruin just because it's haunted, so that no mortal can stand it to live there. Like, that's fascinating to me if we take seriously this idea of slavery continuing its afterlife, right? And slavery becomes this. Yeah, like the skipper can't understand why, like, why would this be a problem? It's just a haunted house. It's a comfortable house you should be living in. And like, it totally refuses to reckon with the ghost that is still there. And I feel like, to me, I see not as saying it's hopeless, but that until we can actually reckon with this spirit that is still existing, we can't make progress, right? We can't move forward because the past is here all around us. We can't move beyond by just forgetting about it or pretending it doesn't matter in some way. That, of course, is not at all what the skipper says, but I think skipper says we want the opposite.
Yeah, right.
To go back to
And
what
this-
Peg was asking about, I kind of thought about it. I thought about that too. Why is she writing this now? And I wonder if she came to the same point at this time that she was before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, when she said, I can't keep my mouth shut anymore. You know, this is really still bothering me, and I've got to, you know, say something about it. Do we know why? I mean, is there any reviews, any talk about this story at the time? Did we know why it just kind of went totally obscure? Did just nobody pay attention to it? Was she screaming into the wind? And nobody was
I
paying any
think so.
attention?
That's what it appears to be from, based on some of the background information. And
People didn't want to hear it. And the journal that she published it in did not last too long,
Hmm.
but it had enough circulation that if people had been interested in the story, they would have picked up on it. No, I think it reflects the changing times and the unwillingness of a northern audience to confront the depths of the racism that were still going on. After the euphoria, after the wave, we won the war, everything's great. It didn't work out that way, and
well, you know,
let's go fishing.
like the other author, you know, you have your time in the spotlight, and obviously her spotlight was dimming. She probably, for many people, was like, oh, battle lady, yeah, we, you know, her. It was just other people had stepped. So, I don't, you would know more who these people are.
She's 71, so she is the old
Oh,
one.
that's really, I think she, or, yeah, she.
But she cranked out a story like this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I
And
wonder why she published it in that publication instead of, I mean, did she try to publish it at the Atlantic and they wouldn't publish it?
I think that probably happened. I don't think this was something that people
Because
in
she
the
had
more
published so many other
mainstream.
things in the Atlantic is why I asked, you know.
Well, I was reading the article in which the story was embedded, and it talks about the illustrations for the that were very much tonally like placating, like this is a romantic story of the Old South, rather than actually depicting the violence and horror of the story. And so that's also interesting to me to think about the way in which not just the magazine that it was part of, but also like the apparatus of the story itself was at odds with reading this as a much more serious critique, right? It's able to be just set aside as like, oh yes, one more story from the past rather than a present story. Which struck me as
Serious for that story was the same artist that did the Uncle Remus case.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, you go to that,
Yeah.
nice flat man kind of rah, yay, sweet, practically folk tales basically.
Yeah.
And so by wrapping it, there's the disparity between the design and the content really doesn't do the story any. It doesn't give it any benefit, that's for sure.
Quick final comment on the story. The idea of throwing enslaved people overboard on ships was something that happened and was known about.
Yeah.
The Zong incident in 1781 that Olado Equiano brought to light. There was a French ship that did it in 1812, and all sorts of examples probably that we don't know of. But I think she's also harking back to that. And John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a poem about that in the 1830s that Stowe surely would have read, called The Slave Ships, about throwing enslaved people overboard in chains, so they would certainly drown.
Yeah, you want to turn to the
Yeah, let's go to Emily.
Emily. So Faulkner said this story arose in his mind through this an image, the image of that hair on the pillow as a ghost story, the strand of hair in this house that is no longer occupied. So what is so important to you, or what do you think was so important to Faulkner about that image? What is striking about it to you? What does that say to you? Yeah, go for it.
Anyone? I mean, it's very. I guess one of my, I'm hearing since this Haversham.
Yeah.
In terms of just an idea that, you know, someone who's longing for the past, but the idea that she's been sleeping next to a dead body for decades, it's just really creepy. So
Mhm.
you know, the strand of hair is just a symbol of all of that creepiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she's been sleeping next to a dead body for years, as you said, and that's horrific. But it's a dead body that, as I understand, because she went to buy the arsenic, a person she killed.
Yep.
And
It was for release.
yeah,
Yeah.
so she killed her lover, and they must have had she must have had some reason for that. We don't know what reason, but then she sleeps with him for years and years. Horrific.
No.
Because remember, he left. And he went away, and then he came back a little later, and the Negro leaves the man by the back door. That's the best we see of it. But she had gone, she had bought the special inscribed items that you would buy for a bridegroom, and she had bought that collar, she had bought all these things. She could have killed him and then dressed him up and put him in that bed.
Right, so we were chatting a little bit while you guys were off touring, and this came up. And, you know, maybe she did kill him because now he can't leave.
Mhm.
Yeah.
He's gotta stay there.
She probably carried on conversations with it. Someone wanted for breakfast. Fix it. Yeah, yeah.
So in the very, my impression, which is often wrong, is that unlike the first two stories, signed readings, this one wasn't. I didn't feel like this one was done to make a point. I felt like this one was done more for the entertainment value.
Mhm.
Because I found it much easier to read than the first two, my opinion. Just the way it flowed, and it was much more of a, you know, at the very end. Yes, the other two had shocking components, but this is the one that he tried to engineer it to build up to up. Yeah, so I felt like that was intentional. It was supposed to be more enjoyed in a top fashion.
Which is interesting that you said it was easier to read because Faulkner is usually
Right.
like people say he's so hard to read.
Yeah.
And maybe that comes mostly from The Sound and the Fury, but it's Faulkner is Faulkner. And maybe that's the only other Faulkner thing I've read, and that was like decades ago. But you know, most of the time I hear people say Faulkner is difficult to read. And so it's interesting that you said this was the easiest to read.
Yeah, this was the easiest Faulkner. They should start us with this.
Yeah, it's a very approachable story. And I totally agree with you that it has the shape of the sort of Gothic reveal story in a much more defined way than the other two do. Which is really interesting. Sure that it doesn't have deeper things going on too. But yeah, in terms of like, is it enjoyable to read? Absolutely. I mean, when they start sprinkling lime around a house, the weird smell in a Gothic story, I'm already thinking who has been killed. But nonetheless, it's still a very like pleasurable reveal at the end when you're like, oh, the depths of the grossness.
Necrophilia.
Yeah.
That's the term.
Significance, if any, do you see in her having this male Negro servant who comes in and he's like a teenager when he starts working for her, and then ultimately just walks out that door, but he's this faithful servant year after year after year after year. Is that really what he is?
Mhm.
Or, I mean, you know, it's a kind of cliche, right?
Yeah,
It is.
Um. I guess he needed that vehicle in order to get heated in and out of his house. I guess, you know. But I just wondered if if there was any kind of relationship there. I didn't.
No.
Why does anybody else do?
you know, he's a marginalized figure. By Faulkner as in, by Emily. I think he's a device, but I don't see him as anything else. And I think that's a failure in the story.
Well, you're just a stereotypical Southern device. Like,
Yeah.
you know, who else is gonna? Right, I mean, someone who brings them, you know, who takes care of the house or whatever, so it's, yeah.
It would,
It's still something. It's such a good story.
What is the whole significance of the tax of? The tax not being, you know, well, I don't have to pay the tax because. The,
Colonel Sartre's told me I didn't
I
have.
don't have to pay the tax.
I think we just threw that in there.
Well, I think, well, one, it's deeply enjoyable, right? Like, you're this woman who's just like, yeah, no. And then the town is flummoxed by this, like, have to just kind of go away and do their own thing. But, you know, she's held up at the beginning, right? The men, through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, right? The women mostly out of a curiosity to see the inside of her house. Like, who is this woman? She is to the town a monument, a duty, a tradition, a care, hereditary obligation, right? Like, these things are symbolic. Like, she has become the symbol of bigger things. And if you think about what she has done by literally keeping a dead body in her house, refusal, and this
significant.
refusal to let go of a possibility or like to hold on to something, like the town too has enabled this in many, many ways. I mean, had anyone asked that servant any questions, he could certainly have told some tales. I don't know if he would have, but like, so like,
So yeah, why didn't anybody question?
yeah,
for years?
there's a certain culpability of the people in this that I find really interesting. It's not centered in any way, but when you have them coming in and saying, well, you have to pay your taxes, and she's like, no, and they don't know what to do about that, so they just leave. Like, that's a failure of will, of the ability to confront somebody, or to there's something going on there with the passivity of the town, which our narrator is obviously one of. Like, it starts to be we at one point, like, we believed this, right? They're this collective group of people in response to her.
Well, was that not just because she was of the family that was the most well-known, the most connected in the town, even though she's the last of the bunch and is very eccentric, obviously. So that's where I saw that. I have one other little quibble. Why did the lime make the smell go away? If they put it out in the yard and in the outbuildings and in the basement, if he was dead if he was dead in the bedroom upstairs.
I think the smell went away when the corpse got old enough.
Yeah.
Just dried up.
Yeah.
And I have that experience with corpse.
It was just a coincidence that it happened at the same time. Okay.
Well, but so she was. It felt like her family had been the head, you know, like the top family, but then they had some kind of like misfortune where they weren't really the richest anymore, but the Sartorius or whoever,
Sartre, yeah.
you know, said, well, I'll, you know, we'll pretend, we'll help, we'll.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I know you can't afford the taxes, so I'm just gonna say, tell you that your dad had loaned the town money, that he didn't really. Nah, I don't think so.
No.
Nah.
You know,
We'll just tell, you know, we'll just tell you that, so, or tell she. Not explaining this very well. He just told her that so that she wouldn't have to pay the taxes and she wouldn't be suspicious and so, but it just made me feel all confident. No, I don't have to pay the taxes. No, they told me I didn't pay the taxes.
Colonel Sartre is one of the Southern aristocrats, a powerful member of the family. He shows up in some of Faulkner's other books.
really,
As a not altogether nice guy, but and even in this story, remember, he's the one who had the edict that no Negro
Without
could be on the street without a name.
yeah.
Um,
The Faulkner, that whole mystique of the Faulkner families, it's in here. Well, you know, how it goes through all of those books. And what, I think when her granddaughter was mentally unstable,
Yeah.
and you know, she had these two cousins who obviously kept her at arm's length or fired her, but then showed up when they were required to because of obligation. So, you know, some of the Faulkner familyness, you know, really helps to hold up the story and make it more credible too.
but I think it's also the idea of holding on to the past again. And clearly Emily wants to do that. Why does she want to do that? Well, remember her father. Faulkner felt sorry for Emily. He saw her as a victim, victimized by her father. Remember, he chased all the suitors away. And then she couldn't accept that.
She wouldn't let him go either. She
Yeah.
kept his body around for several days before they broke the door down and got him out. So again, the town should have had suspicion of this guy never appearing again. But yeah, I mean, clearly the idea that one would be victimized by somebody and then become very attached to the person who victimizes you is not.
It's psychologically accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a weird line in here, right, about the Homer Baron, about his sexuality, maybe? Yeah. Right. She will not persuade him yet because Homer himself had remarked he liked men. It was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club. He was not a marrying man. What this?
It's ambiguous.
Yeah, it's in enough so that, yeah, to join, I'm not sure that they were lovers. Like, I'm not convinced that they had any relationship prior to him. Which then is even when he covered for me. Yeah, I mean, potentially, yeah, until that became unsatisfactory and then whatever.
And he said, I'm tired of this, I'm leaving. And she said, no, you're not. Have a drink. I think the whole story, I think, it fits into Faulkner's canon pretty well because so many of his characters fixated on the past. Like those Confederate soldiers who show up at her funeral and think the past is this endless, this beautiful meadow that never changes. And instead of what they should see it as, the way Faulkner described the past, as a diminishing road, basically. Things are always changing. Time is moving in Faulkner. It's a paradox because on the one hand, he'll say that it's a diminishing road. Time's always moving and you have to adapt. On the other hand, he'll say the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. As in one in Requiem for a Nun later in his canon So the past is always with us. You can't get away from it, but on the other hand, you can't live in it either. And that's what I'm always trying to do. That's what I think he saw the South trying to do at the time he wrote this story, 1930. With the segregation in full swing. This is before the civil rights movement really got going, got traction, and I think he's looking at a society that is just absolutely in love with the past and backward looking and gone with the wind and celebrating all that. And poor Emily gets caught in the middle of this, really. I always think of her as sort of a Southern belle born too late. Too late. And remember Amanda Wingfield and the Glass Menagerie and Blanche Dubois with Belle Reeve and all these women who are sort of raised to be a certain kind of person on a pedestal, and yet that's not the way the world's working anymore.
Maybe it might be more merciful had they just fallen into the Mississippi River. Gone on to live with corpse for a lover for years and years.
I think the town needs her.
Yeah, I mean, she is their monument, right?
Right.
As
What's
much
she gonna do now? Look what she did. So it doesn't make the town look very good either, right?
You could have sit on issue this, we could write next. Well, the town knocked it down. It was the last house standing on the street over there. Inns and gas stations had been built up around.
Oh, right, yeah.
It'll be bought by a developer.
There you go. Oh, there's taxes, so
The town would own it.
there's no relative, so.
All right, well, we go ask questions.
Well, I think in a way we covered a lot of that last question, and then about Gothic elements and how they connect with the social dimensions. I mean, the ghost I hear running through all of these stories, or at least number 1 and number 3, is Poe. Think about that mansion, the Demoiselles Plantation, and they start to see that crack in the levee, and then like the House of Usher goes down.
Right.
And this last one, the Annabelle Lee, yeah, that's silly, then. And the Telltale Heart, where the narrator is driven to stop time, he can't stand that camera or whatever it is on the old man's eye, so he kills him. Swine, of course, that's what you do. Yeah. And then he hears the heart, or thinks he hears the heart beating, and it's time. That's just, he's obsessed with the passage of time. This isn't a Gothic connection, but when I read the captain's story, I started thinking about Conrad's The Art of Darkness, which might seem like a stretch. And then I found an article in which somebody was arguing in Uncle Tom's Cabin, especially the Simon Legree sections, it may have had an influence on Conrad as he was writing The Heart of Darkness. Who'd have thought that? Yeah. So I guess that's my final comment on Toll, Joseph Conrad, everybody. Kristen?
All right.
Oh, I think to me, they all seem in their own interesting ways reminiscent of both Poe to me, but also Absalom keeps like moving through my mind in many of these, which both features a kind of haunted house, but also is absolutely obsessed with the familial legacy of people and the brutality of enslavement. And so I would recommend that reading to you.
Yeah.
It's not easy reading,
No.
but also thinking about it too in the context of like Confederate memorials and ways in which we think about like what it means to honor a past that is so at odds with values that we would want to espouse. Like that's a really challenging text in those ways. And I saw some of that coming up.
Yeah, and my recommendation for how to read Faulkner when you run up against a book like that is plow through it, get through it. You might feel like you're in the swamp, but run through the swamp. And when you get out the other side, a lot of things start to make more sense. So just be immersed in that stream of consciousness. And Absalom is an absolute great book.
Yeah.
Amazing.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone online for joining us. I want to thank everyone here for joining us, and check out our website for all the additional cool stuff going on. We will be back for this series the first Wednesday of November. And the topic then is?
It's on the day after election. And we're looking at the only successful coup d'etat in American history, as written in Charles Chestnut's novel, The Marrow of Tradition, a novel based on an 1898 actual white supremacist coup in Wilmington, North Carolina.
Well, on that happy note. Again, thank you all for contributing. We appreciate it. And we will see you next time.
Thank you all.